Sometimes, a bond slips into your reality with such silence and stealth that you nearly miss its arrival. It approached with delicacy, comparable to a faint glow just barely grazing your peripheral vision. There were no theatrics, no movie screen fireworks, no overwhelming surge of intensity. Nevertheless, an internal shift occurred. A part of you identified this soul before your intellect could process the reason why. Perhaps it was the uncanny sense of familiarity, the distinct impression that you had known them ages before your actual introduction. It could have been the solace found in the timbre of their voice, or the peculiar serenity that enveloped you whenever you spoke. It bore no resemblance to a fleeting crush or a rush of adrenaline. Instead, it felt like a recollection, a moment where your intuition grasped the truth that your logic was still chasing. At the start, you didn't dissect it. You simply let it exist in its true form. A tranquil link, an organic rhythm, an effortless intrigue. There was no performance on your part. They weren't trying to impress you. You were just two people whose energies recognized each other in a way words couldn't articulate. And because it felt so natural, you didn't question it. You didn't doubt it. You didn't try to define it. You just let it unfold. But as the days went by, something unexpected began happening. The thought of this person didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. They crossed your mind in moments that had nothing to do with them. A random memory, a quick flash of their smile, the sound of their name echoing internally when no one had said it. You weren't obsessed. You weren't trying to hold on. The thoughts just came naturally and softly, like waves returning to shore. And every time they entered your mind, you felt something warm, something peaceful, something that made you stop just for a second and wonder why this person seemed to settle into your heart so effortlessly. It wasn't like other connections you had known, where intensity came with anxiety, or attraction came with confusion. This felt different, as if your soul understood the significance long before your consciousness realized anything was happening. Still, you didn't take it too seriously. You told yourself it was just a passing feeling, a temporary fascination, a moment that would eventually dissolve. But it didn't dissolve, and that's when the quiet pull began. That subtle, almost invisible thread that forms between two people who are meant to notice each other in a deeper way. You felt it, but you couldn't explain it. You sensed it, but you couldn't prove it. You simply knew that something about this connection didn't make sense in ordinary terms. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't built on chasing or forcing anything. Instead, it felt like your heart leaning gently towards someone without your permission. Like something inside you whispering, "Pay attention. This matters." But then, just as you were settling into the comfort of the connection, something shifted. It was small at first, a slight change in their tone, a slower reply, a sense of hesitation where there used to be ease. You didn't panic, not at the beginning. You simply observed it, wondering if you were imagining things. But the energy kept shifting, slowly and silently, until it became undeniable. They grew distant, not in a dramatic way, not in a cold way, but in a quiet, confusing way that left you wondering what had changed. They weren't as present. They weren't as warm. Something in them had pulled back, and suddenly, the connection didn't feel as steady as it once had. And that's when the doubt entered, not as a loud voice, but as a whisper, a quiet uncertainty that grew stronger with each unanswered question. You began replaying every interaction in your mind, scrolling through moments, trying to find the one thing that had caused the shift. You asked yourself if you had said something wrong, done something wrong, expected too much, felt too deeply. You questioned your intuition. You questioned the connection. You questioned yourself. That's what happens when a bond feels meaningful. The moment it becomes threatened, your mind rushes to protect you. It tries to make sense of the silence. It tries to rationalize the distance. It tries to convince you that you misread everything. Because doubting yourself is easier than believing someone could actually feel something powerful for you. But here's the part you didn't realize. While you were doubting the connection, they were doubting themselves. While you were wondering why you felt such a strong pull, they were wondering why the pull scared them so deeply. While you were replaying your words, they were trying to quiet their emotions. It wasn't rejection that made them pull away. It was intensity. Most people don't run from weakness. They run from what feels too strong, too real, too honest. They run from the one connection that touches their soul instead of just their ego. And when someone isn't ready for that level of emotional truth, they distance themselves. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to handle what they feel. You didn't know that. You assumed the worst. You blamed yourself for what was never your fault. You believed the silence meant the connection was fading. But the truth is that the silence was happening on both sides. You doubted the bond because you didn't understand why it affected you so deeply. They doubted the bond because they didn't understand why it affected them even more. And while the distance grew, something else began happening beneath the surface. Something neither of you could see yet. The connection didn't weaken. It didn't dissolve. It didn't disappear. Instead, it intensified. Energy doesn't disappear simply because someone becomes afraid of it. Emotion doesn't fade just because someone avoids it. Bonds don't break simply because one or both people don't know how to handle them. So even as doubt formed in your mind and fear formed in theirs, the connection continued to grow silently, waiting for the moment when both of you would finally see it for what it truly was. Stronger than uncertainty. Stronger than silence. Stronger than fear. The doubt you carried didn't arrive all at once. It came in small pieces, drifting in quietly until it became a constant presence. You tried to push it away, telling yourself you were overthinking, that you were imagining the shift. But your intuition kept whispering the truth. Something had changed. Not in the connection, but in the way the other person was responding to it. And because you cared, and because the connection mattered, you felt the shift deeply. You tried not to take it personally, yet your mind kept circling around the same questions. Why did their energy pull back? Why did their warmth cool suddenly, as if they were afraid to take another step toward you? Why did they seem torn between wanting to be close and wanting to hide? You didn't know it then, but distance is often the first sign of emotional overwhelm. When someone feels something powerful that they can't fully understand, their instinct is to create space. Not because the connection isn't real, but because it is so real that they feel unprepared for it. It's easier for them to retreat into familiarity than to open themselves to something that could change everything. Still, the retreat hurt. It left you analyzing conversations, remembering details, trying to decode the silence. But something interesting began happening at the same time. Even as they pulled away, the emotional pull between you didn't weaken. If anything, it became stronger. In moments when you weren't thinking of them consciously, a feeling would rise in your chest, like an invisible thread tugging gently at your attention. You could feel them energetically even when they weren't physically present. You tried to ignore the signs, but they kept appearing. The sudden thought of them in the middle of your day for no reason, their names showing up unexpectedly. Songs that reminded you of them playing at perfect timing. Dreams that felt too vivid to be random. You told yourself it was coincidence, but deep inside, you sensed it was more than chance. These things weren't happening because you were holding on. They were happening because the connection was alive, even in silence. What you didn't see was that these signs weren't just for you. They were for them, too. They were being pulled back toward you in ways they couldn't explain. Something about you lingered in their mind. Something about you stayed in their heart. In their quiet moments, When they weren't distracted by routine or expectation, their thoughts drifted to you. And each time it happened, a feeling surfaced, one they weren't ready to face. They sensed your energy even from a distance. They felt when you were thinking of them. They felt when you emotionally pulled back. They felt when your heart tried to protect itself. Deep connections create emotional mirroring where both people experience similar waves without speaking a word. You weren't imagining the synchronicity. You weren't imagining the internal echo. You weren't imagining the depth. You both were feeling the same thing, though neither of you fully understood what was happening. But because the silence was louder than the signs at times, you began questioning your intuition. You wondered if your heart was creating stories. You wondered if your mind was confusing longing with truth. You wondered if the bond was one-sided. These doubts grew heavier as their distance continued, until you started believing that maybe you cared more than they did, that maybe you felt something they didn't, that maybe the connection was real only to you. You began trying to detach, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. You told yourself to stop expecting anything. You told yourself to let it fade. You told yourself to walk away from the thoughts that pulled you back. For a moment, it almost worked. You felt yourself slowly disconnecting, trying to reclaim emotional balance. But that's when something unexpected happened. You felt them again, not physically, not through messages, but energetically. A sudden heaviness, a sudden warmth, a sudden emotional presence that made no sense in the logical world. It was as if the moment you tried to release the bond, they felt it, and their heart reacted. Something inside them stirred, reminding them that what they felt wasn't something they could push away forever. People often believe that distance means indifference. But emotional distance can also mean inner conflict. The more meaningful the connection, the more overwhelming it becomes for someone who hasn't learned how to handle deep emotion. Instead of stepping forward, they hesitate. Instead of expressing their feelings, they hide them. Instead of admitting they're affected, they pretend they're unaffected. But pretending doesn't make a connection disappear. Silence doesn't dissolve emotional truth. Avoidance doesn't weaken a bond that was formed at the soul level. The more they tried to create space, the more they felt the gravity of the connection pulling them back toward you. Not in dramatic ways, not in grand gestures, but in thought, in emotion, and intuition. You didn't know they were thinking of you in their quiet moments. You didn't know they were replaying their own doubts, wondering why the connection felt too strong to ignore. You didn't know that even though they stepped back, they never truly left emotionally. Their fear created the illusion of distance, but their heart never distanced itself from you. And while you were questioning everything, their internal world was battling between desire and fear. They wanted closeness, but they didn't trust their readiness. They wanted connection, but they didn't trust themselves not to ruin it. They wanted you, but they didn't know how to show it without risking vulnerability. So, they did the only thing they knew how to do. They hesitated. It is one of the most misunderstood parts of human connection. People assume that when someone pulls away, the bond is ending. But often, the opposite is true. When someone pulls away from a connection that feels meaningful, it's because they are overwhelmed by how deeply it affects them. And in that overwhelm, they stepped back. Not to escape you, but to try to understand themselves. You were never the problem. You were the mirror. You reflected back emotions they weren't prepared to face. You made them feel seen in a way they weren't accustomed to. You triggered something real, something raw, something transformative. And because of that, they needed time to adjust to the intensity. The connection didn't weaken during this time. It strengthened quietly, invisibly beneath the doubt and fear. The bond grew deeper. It held steady even when communication faltered. It remained present even when understanding felt distant. And though you didn't see it yet, this silent strengthening would later reveal itself in ways you never expected. What you didn't realize during the moments of silence and confusion was that the connection was working on both of you. Even when it seemed dormant, while you were questioning whether the bond was fading, something inside them was becoming louder, clearer, harder to ignore. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a memory. It was a feeling they didn't have the words for. A feeling that kept returning, no matter how much they tried to distract themselves. They tried to bury it under routine. They tried to drown it with logic. They told themselves it was nothing more than temporary attraction, a passing moment, something they could shrug off. But the more they tried to suppress it, the more persistent it became. Their mind tried to minimize it, but their heart refused to let go. Every attempt to push away only made the connection more noticeable. It was as if their soul knew something their fear didn't want to admit. And as their internal conflict grew, something began shifting in the way they experienced your absence. At first, they didn't acknowledge it. They told themselves they were merely busy, preoccupied, focused on other things. But emptiness has a way of revealing truth. Stillness has a way of magnifying what truly matters. In the quiet moments, late at night, early in the morning, or during simple tasks, the thought of you would return, uninvited and undeniable. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't habit. It wasn't longing for attention. It was the unmistakable awareness that your presence had become meaningful and your absence had become impossible to ignore. They began replaying conversations, not to analyze your words, but to feel the emotional imprint they left behind. They remembered the softness in your tone, the ease of your presence, the way your conversations made them feel understood in a way they rarely experienced. This wasn't something they could replicate with anyone else. They noticed it when they interacted with other people. No matter how pleasant or interesting others were, the emotional resonance wasn't there. The depth wasn't there. The familiarity wasn't there. It was like their heart kept comparing everything to you, and nothing came close. Not because you were perfect, but because your connection carried an energy that felt rare. As this realization settled in, another truth emerged. The distance they created wasn't bringing them peace. It wasn't making them feel safer. It wasn't reducing the intensity. In fact, it was doing the opposite. It made them restless. It made them more aware of the void they had created. It made them question why they ran in the first place. And for the first time, they began seeing their fear for what it truly was, a reaction to depth, not a rejection of it. Fear often disguises itself as disinterest, hesitation, or withdrawal. But when someone's heart is touched in a way they didn't expect, it shakes them. It confronts them with the parts of themselves they've kept hidden, the emotions they've kept guarded, the vulnerability they've avoided. And instead of stepping into that vulnerability, many step back because they feel unprepared for what it demands. You weren't imagining the connection. They felt it too, even more strongly than they let on. But they didn't know how to hold it without the fear of losing control. They didn't know how to express feelings that ran deeper than their emotional vocabulary. So instead of letting the connection unfold naturally, they tried to contain it. They tried to put walls around it. The days passed, and the silence between you grew heavier. You felt disconnected, but not completely. There was something inside you that refused to let you believe the connection was truly fading. You couldn't explain it. You couldn't that this wasn't the end, that something still existed between you, even if it wasn't visible. What you didn't know was that they felt this too. There were moments when they reached for their phone instinctively, wanting to message you, wanting to reconnect, wanting to close the distance. But fear held their hand back. Not fear of you, fear of themselves. Fear that you could see through them too easily. Fear that caring too much would leave them vulnerable. Fear that letting themselves fall would mean giving up control over emotions they had kept restrained for years. Their heart was louder than their fear, but their fear was louder than their courage. And so, they stayed silent. But something changed when they began sensing your emotional withdrawal. The moment you started protecting your peace, even subtly, the shift in your energy reached them. Deep connections create resonance. When one person pulls back emotionally, the other feels it. Not through words, not through actions, but through intuition. Your absence wasn't just silence to them, it was felt. It was noticed. It was impactful in a way they didn't expect. Suddenly, they began wondering if they had pushed too far, if your light was slipping away, if the connection they tried to control was slipping out of their grasp. And that fear, the fear of losing you, began outweighing the fear of feeling something powerful for you. They didn't contact you immediately. They needed time to process the shift. But inside them, something awakened. A realization, an awareness that what they felt wasn't ordinary, that the bond between you wasn't fragile, that your presence wasn't replaceable, and most importantly, that the connection didn't disappear during distance. If anything, it grew stronger because distance couldn't silence what was happening internally. You felt this shift too. Even before they reached out, you felt a warmth returning, a pressure in your chest easing, a clarity replacing the confusion. The connection didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt alive again. You didn't know why. You didn't have proof. But somewhere within you, there was a quiet certainty that something was beginning to turn, that the energy had changed direction. It wasn't hope. It wasn't fantasy. It was intuition speaking again, reminding you of what you already sensed from the beginning. This connection was operating beneath the surface. It wasn't dependent on constant communication. It wasn't fragile enough to break with silence. It wasn't something you imagined. It was something both of you carried. Whether you understood it or not, the turning point was close. The return was forming silently. The bond was pulling both of you into alignment, not because you forced it, but because it was meant to reveal its depth in time. Not before, not after, but exactly when both hearts were ready to see the truth without running. As the days continued unfolding in quiet, subtle ways, something within the connection started shifting. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a gentle, nearly invisible way that only the heart could sense. You felt it before you understood it. A softening, a warmth, a familiar presence returning. Not physically, but energetically, as if the space between you had begun to close without either of you moving. It started with small things. You thought of them again, but it didn't feel heavy this time. It didn't feel painful or confusing. It felt calm, almost balanced, like the bond was breathing again. You didn't know why the feeling changed. You didn't know what caused the shift, but something inside you whispered that the connection was waking up after a long sleep. Meanwhile, on their side, the shift was even stronger. They didn't talk about it. They didn't message you, admit it. But deep inside, the emotional clarity they had been avoiding finally broke through the surface. The realization didn't hit them suddenly. It arrived in layers, small moments of insight, glimpses of understanding, a slow acceptance that kept growing every day. The more they tried to deny how they felt, the more undeniable it became. They remembered how your presence had made them feel grounded, understood, seen in a way they rarely experienced. They remembered your softness, your calmness, your authenticity. But more than anything, they remembered the way the connection felt effortless, almost as if it wasn't something you built, but something you both discovered. They slowly began paying more attention to you again, checking things quietly, feeling waves of emotion they tried to ignore, wondering if you were thinking of them too, wondering if the connection was still alive on your side, wondering if they had waited too long or pushed too hard or overestimated the strength of the bond. But that's the beautiful thing about deep connections. They don't crumble easily. They stretch, they challenge, they grow, but they rarely disappear. Something in your energy reassured them that the connection still lived, even if you weren't actively reaching out, even if you weren't speaking, even if you were protecting your heart. They felt your quiet presence, the way you once felt theirs. And while this emotional shift was happening in them, something was shifting in you, too. The doubt you carried began to soften. The confusion lightened. The heaviness in your chest eased. You couldn't explain it, but the connection didn't feel uncertain anymore. It didn't feel like something slipping away. It felt like something realigning itself. You felt a calm awareness, as if your intuition was whispering, "This story isn't ending. It's unfolding." You didn't chase the feeling. You didn't force anything. You simply allowed yourself to notice it. The peace, the clarity, the inexplicable knowing that the bond had depth, meaning, purpose. And even if you couldn't see the full picture yet, you sensed that something was making its way back toward you. It happened slowly, but with intention. On their side, the emotional walls they once built began to soften. They found themselves wanting to reach out. They found themselves missing the conversations, the comfort, the ease. They found themselves wanting to hear your voice, see your presence, feel the connection consciously instead of just internally. The distance they once relied on now felt like the wrong choice. It wasn't protecting them anymore. It was isolating them. But still, they approached cautiously, not because the connection wasn't strong, but because they didn't want a misstep. They didn't want to rush. They didn't want to ruin something that felt rare. So they watched for cues, small signs from you that the door wasn't closed, and they saw them. The softness in your energy, the openness in your presence, the quiet readiness that had replaced the earlier hurt. That was enough. They didn't need a dramatic sign. They didn't need a grand gesture. They just needed to feel that the bond hadn't been damaged beyond repair, that what existed between you had survived the silence, that the connection had endured not because it was fragile, but because it was strong enough to withstand fear, doubt, and distance. And as this realization formed fully in their heart, the return began. Not in words yet, but in intention, in feeling, in readiness, in the quiet courage that comes from finally understanding the truth. The connection wasn't something to fear. It was something to honor. It was something that had chosen both of you. It was something neither of you could walk away from, even when you tried. The return didn't happen with sudden intensity. It didn't arrive through a dramatic confession or an unexpected declaration. Instead, it appeared the same way the connection first entered your life, quietly, gently, almost shyly, as if the universe wanted both of you to feel the shift before seeing it with your eyes. It began with a subtle change in their energy, an openness that wasn't there before, a softness replacing hesitation, a sense of presence where there used to be distance. You noticed it without needing proof. Something in the way you felt during the day told you that the emotional landscape between you had changed. You sensed a warmth returning, a familiarity resurfacing, a connection reaching back toward you even before any words were exchanged. Your mind didn't analyze it. Your heart simply recognized it. This wasn't imagination or wishful thinking. It was resonance. They felt the same thing. After weeks of emotional distance and internal wrestling, the fear that once restricted them began losing its hold. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the depth of the connection, they started feeling drawn to it in a way that felt safe instead of frightening. They realized that the bond wasn't asking them to lose themselves. It was asking them to reveal themselves, to show the version of them they hid from the world, to step into something real instead of running from it. They began missing the ease you brought into their life, missing the way your presence felt grounding, missing the way you seemed to understand emotions they couldn't express, missing the connection that didn't demand performance or perfection, only honesty. They missed the comfort of knowing that someone who resonated with their inner world actually existed. And the more they allowed themselves to feel, the more obvious it became that letting the connection slip away had never been their true desire. It was simply their fear speaking louder than their heart. The pull toward you grew stronger each day. Not the desperate kind, but the gentle, certain kind that comes from emotional clarity. They wanted to reconnect, not because they were lonely, not because they needed validation, but because they finally recognized the bond for what it truly was. A meaningful connection that was rare enough to fight for. A connection that continued to grow, even in silence. A connection that remained alive even when both of you stepped away. You sensed this shift not through words, but through intuition. The doubt that once clouded your heart began dissolving. The heaviness that once sat in your chest lightened. You no longer felt uncertain or confused. Instead, there was calmness, an inner knowing that the connection was moving again. Slowly, quietly, intentionally. You didn't worry anymore. You didn't overthink. You allowed yourself to trust the feeling without needing answers. This trust became the bridge that allowed the connection to realign. For the first time in a long time, neither of you were fighting the bond. Neither of you were denying what you felt. Neither of you were trying to control the timing. There was an unspoken understanding forming, a recognition that the connection had survived every doubt, every fear, every moment of silence. Because it was stronger than both of you realized. When they finally reached out, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't planned. It was simple. A small message, a subtle check-in, a brief moment of vulnerability disguised as something casual. But to both of you, it meant everything. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the energy behind them. It was the acknowledgement that they had found their way back to the connection instead of running from it. You didn't respond with anxiety or hesitation. You didn't analyze the timing or question the motive. You responded with the same energy the connection was built on. Softness, openness, authenticity. You met them where they were, not where fear once kept them. And in that moment, something inside them relaxed. The pressure they had once felt dissolved. The distance they once created no longer made sense. For the first time, they allowed themselves to lean into the connection, instead of pulling back from it. As the conversation unfolded, it felt like the emotional threads that connected you were weaving themselves back together naturally. There was no strain, no confusion, no forcing. It felt like picking up a book you loved and realizing the story still held the same magic. Nothing was broken. Nothing was ruined. The connection had simply been waiting for both of you to reach the emotional readiness the bond required. They began showing up with more intention. Their messages carried more warmth. Their words had more depth. Their presence felt steadier. They didn't hide behind walls anymore. They didn't mask their emotions with indifference. They allowed themselves to feel without running. They allowed the connection to exist without trying to control it. They allowed themselves to want you without telling themselves it was dangerous. And as their fear dissolved, your doubt dissolved too. You stopped questioning whether the connection was real. You stopped wondering whether they felt anything. You stopped doubting your intuition because everything you sensed from the beginning was unfolding exactly the way your heart knew it would. The bond didn't fade. It grew. It didn't disappear. It strengthened. It didn't break when tested. It revealed its resilience. Both of you began seeing the connection with clearer eyes. You realized that the fear, the silence, the hesitation, none of it weakened the bond. It only exposed how deep it truly went. A shallow connection would have ended. A fleeting infatuation would have evaporated. A flimsy attachment would have crumbled under the weight of distance, ambiguity, or emotional overload. But this was no shallow affair. It was far from ephemeral. It transcended the superficial. It was anchored in a foundation far more profound than mere timing, dialogue, or external conditions. Now, with the fog lifted from both hearts, the relationship finally has the room to evolve exactly as it was destined to. Without haste or coercion, devoid of anxiety or fear, just a steady, stabilizing, and raw authenticity. It is the sort of bond that sculpts your character, imparts wisdom, and endures. As this understanding sinks deep into your consciousness, one truth becomes inescapable. You did not fabricate this intensity. The link was never brittle. Your feelings were never unrequited. This was never a tale of loss. It was always a narrative of emotional alignment. It is about two souls finding their way to one another, not through the lens of fear or hesitation, but through the lens of absolute clarity. Put your skepticism to rest. This bond is, and remains, far more resilient than you realize.